and welcome to our newest episode on the Psyche Zone of SWPS University. My name is Dr. Martą Porębiak, and I will be talking today about suicide, the meaning of life, and survival with Professor Christian Rück, the renowned psychiatrist from Karolinska Institute in Sweden, who is also an author of an amazing book that was recently released also in Polish language, Życie, warte, życia. Hello, it's good to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Professor Rück, let's start maybe from the beginnings. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure our listeners are very curious. What inspired you professionally, but maybe also personally, to write this book?
Well, I have worked in psychiatry for 20 years plus. And I think this topic of suicide comes up all the time. So I also felt that the way we talk about suicide is somewhat limited in the sense that I feel that we try to package it and deal with it in a rather practical way. And that, at least in my experience, rarely talk about what it means. I think we kind of avoid going close to this subject even as professionals. So I wanted to write a book about the most sensitive issues around suicide because I think they are meaningful and they deserve to be discussed.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more.
Yeah.
And in your book, you are sharing many very diverse stories of many people, from parent losing a child and elderly medicine professor who decides to end own life through euthanasia. And reading, I've been wondering, what did you want your readers to understand from such diverse examples?
Well, I think these diverse examples show that suicide can be a lot of things, anything from a young person dying a completely unacceptable death that is devastating to the surroundings, to a 104-year-old professor who dies of euthanasia, where it's seen as okay and quite uncontroversial. So the impact on others seems to differ. So with that, I think the aim is to show how diverse it is. I think I also would want to say that I'm not trying with this book to convince anyone. I'm trying to, explore a very difficult or complex subject. And I think you can arrive at different conclusions reading the book based on your moral and ethical ideas.
And when someone starts to have such thoughts or starts to question own life, is it worth to keep living? How can we understand what could be the reason of having such thoughts? Where can this be coming from?
Well, I mean, that's the big question, I guess, right? Because I think that is also one of the traumatizing things with suicide, that for those who are left behind, this is the big question. Why did this happen? Why didn't we see it? What should we have done? Should I have called this person last Thursday and that I didn't do it? Did this cause it? So there is a lot of focus on this question, I think. So that's, I think, one level of understanding. Another level of understanding would be to try to understand this in a more systematic way, like researchers typically do. And there we find risk indicators for suicide. Being a man, having certain diagnosis. I'm sure in Poland you will see regional differences as well, and like statistical indicators of suicide. And then in the book, I also try to understand why suicide even exists. I mean, like a more meta level of understanding, like why would something that kills an organism survive? Shouldn't that be thrown out, so to speak, by evolution a long time ago. So I think that's another aspect of this, trying to understand why do we have suicide? I mean, it's such a strange thing that an organism would kill itself.
And such a human thing at the same time.
Yeah. So I think that's what I'm trying to say in the book, that it's uniquely human, suicide, and it's a product of our advanced brain. Our brain can do almost magical things with us. We have fantasy. I can imagine how my life would be given this or that. If this book is selling like crazy, I will be happy. But if it's not, I may be unhappy, etc. I can create scenarios and compare myself to others. And we can also understand mortality, which I think is no other species can't. They may be advanced in other ways, but we can understand that mortality exists and that it's permanent. And when you have these things, suddenly this like trap to suicide opens up. And that's a very uniquely human thing that we have. So I think it's important to say that suicide is typically not the product of mistakes, that someone made a mistake, someone should have done better, someone should have done this. It's part of our existence, like.
And a part of being a human is also searching for meaning, the meaning of life in particular.
Yeah, at least for some. I'm not sure everyone does that, but
that's very important.
But I doubt that the horse would think, I'm my life in these stables here is not good. There must be better stables where cooler horses are. I don't think that. That I think it's a human feature that we have this.
So that would require the imagination and the image of
I think
better
so.
life.
The search for meaning is like also part of being human, I think.
And what can help humans to bring the sense of life, especially when they're struggling with some life crisis?
Well, I mean, typically what's stabilizes the situation would be social bonds to other, being part of a community, family, friends, etc. A problem for suicidal people is that if they are, for instance, depressed, they may withdraw from social situations, so they kind of just back out and become isolated. I think what typically brings meaning is also feeling some kind of significance as a person, and that doesn't mean that you have to be a influencer or celebrity or something, but meaning having some kind of importance to other people. And I think for people, for instance, at this university that study psychology, helping people in your work is actually very meaningful. And so I think it can be a variety of things. Then, of course, I think it's good to say that people who have serious mental problems like depression, they may have a good life, but they still can't see the meaning. It's like the light in the tunnel goes out. Everyone else is not understanding what's going on, because they would say that your life is good. You have a family, you have a job, it's all good. But because you have this depression, you can't see it anymore. So it's not always, I think, that you can just adjust your life. Sometimes life is okay and it's something else going on.
And in your book, you are also sharing some epidemiological statistics when it comes to prevalence of suicide. And one of such is the global prevalence of suicides. And you are mentioning that more people die per year through suicide than are killed in wars or in homicides. And this is quite shocking, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, in Sweden, it's about 15 suicide per murder for one murder. So although we are all afraid of crime, especially these days, the likelihood that you kill yourself is much higher in general, of course. So yeah, it is a bit strange. I mean, we talk about suicide, but I'm not sure people understand the scale of it in that sense.
Mm-hmm. And are there any other myths or misconceptions regarding suicide that we can overturn with science?
Yeah, I think there are several. I mean, one I think is that, I think that people who die by suicide, they don't want to die. They just have a very hard time living. So I think sometimes people seem to think that, well, if someone has decided they want to die by suicide, then they will do it. Maybe you can stop it, but they will carry on doing it later on. I think that is completely false. I mean, there is multiple lines of evidence that point to the fact that people who have survived even a very serious suicide attempt typically don't die of suicide later. So they go on with their life in some other way. So I think that's a hopeful message there. As two other things I write about in this book is that it is very hard to predict. And this is, of course, in a way, bad news. But I write it because I think it's important that both clinicians and family and other people understand that it's not that any genius clinician or guru clinician can just pinpoint a person and said, you will certainly die, and know that others won't. So our precision in our assessment is quite bad. It is very hard to predict, even with the best methods. I think also for suicidal patients themselves, it's hard to predict if they will do it or not. It's very unstable and a lot of ambivalence. So I think that how would other people know if you don't know yourself? So I think that's a myth. Another myth, I think, is that it's always solvable. It's not always solvable. We have treatment options, but we don't have treatment options that work all the time. So, and I say that because I don't want family and clinicians to feel all this blame when someone dies. Sometimes you have done your best, you have done everything you should, and people still will die. I think we have a little bit to look at it like cancer or something. It's not. It's unfortunate. We would wish it wouldn't happen at all, but it does. And I want to relieve this guilt and blame from people a little bit. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do your best. We should do more, etc. I'm sure you in this country could be better at giving access to mental health care, etc. But still, even in the perfect society, we will have this.
But also the societies change, and especially in the Western societies, we see a lot of changes when it comes to modern living. And would you see any connection between, let's say, modern pastime activities like the use of technology or social media and mental health these days?
Well, this is a very difficult question. I mean, there has been a lot of debate about this. I don't think there is any proof that it will increase suicide, as suicide in most countries hasn't increased. So we have had this in the younger population, big shift in, how they use their phones or other devices, right? It hasn't been a huge increase in suicides. What we have seen in many countries is that self-harm has gone up. For instance, young teenage girls cutting themselves, not to die, but to self-harm. in Sweden now we say that it's more common that a girl has cut herself than smoked a cigarette. So that is, of course, I'm not promoting cigarette smoking here, but I would rather have someone smoke a cigarette if that would be the choice. So I think we see things like that. But then the more difficult question that you ask is, well, how does our use of technology change our mental health? And I think that's it's difficult. I mean, I don't think we have enormous amounts of data supporting that it's super dangerous. But if I look at my own teenage children, I worry. I mean, they are on phones times that research wouldn't have expected. You know, in Sweden, many teenagers are 10 times an hour on screen. At 10 hours a day on the screen, it's not abnormal, and I think that, of course, that worries me. Of course, also I have written a book, so I would love my children to read books, and it's hard to get them to read books if they are on the phone, etc. So all of this is, to me, worrying. But I'm 55 years old. Maybe my worldview shouldn't be imposed on younger people too. But I worry, but as a researcher, I also feel that, or feel is maybe not the right word for a researcher. I don't think that we have an awful amount of data to back up how to look at this.
And what about such changes in societies when it comes to freedom of choice, personal decision making? And we've seen over the decades more and more countries legalizing assisted suicide or euthanasia with different inclusion criteria.
Well, yeah, that's I think it's a very interesting topic. I mean, also the way you phrase the question is that I think both Poland and Sweden are countries that have developed in a more individualistic direction. Sweden used to be, when I was born, a rather collectivistic society, and now we are among the highest in the world in self-expression, where you as an individual your life is like your project. You should make the most of it. It's you. It's not us. It's not Sweden. It's not your city. It's you. And of course, if it's you and you are so important in your life, I mean, of course you're important, but maybe you shouldn't be too important in your own life. I think that assisted suicide makes a lot of sense. That if I'm to design my whole life, why not also design the end of my life myself? So I think there is a connection between a more individualistic society and a drive towards assisted dying. To me, it makes sense that they connect.
And in those countries where it is legalized, how can we differentiate then later the desire for death through assisted suicide and, for example, suicidal thoughts in a person who is struggling with mental health?
Yeah, so I mean, it's done a little bit differently in different countries. So, and it is illegal in most countries, but actually getting legalized in more. So it's becoming more and more mainstream in the Western world. And typically you would have to see 2 independent doctors that assess you. And if you are actively suicidal, or for instance in an active episode of depression, you would not be considered for it. The complicated thing is that, and I'm not sure everyone is aware of this, that in some countries you can actually get assisted dying, assisted suicide, or euthanasia for psychiatric problems. You don't have to be dying of cancer. So in Holland and in the Netherlands and Belgium, psychiatric euthanasia exists, it's also it's about to be introduced in Canada as well. But also there, if you are just depressed, that wouldn't kind of qualify. But if you are recurrent, if you are depressed on and off, but when you apply not depressed, but you are tired of living because of your depression, that would qualify.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And also that you should have tried treatments, etc.
Uh-huh. And reading your book, I got the impression that you have some concerns as psychiatrist in regards to including mental health conditions as
certainly. I think, especially if you start doing euthanasia on, autistic individuals, etc., that makes I don't support that. But I think even in countries like Switzerland, where there is not psychiatric euthanasia or psychiatric assisted dying, then still I think that I think to have both ideas at the same time is interesting. So one idea would be to have suicide prevention as a national strategy, which most countries have now. Like we try to do things to stop suicides. And at the same time, then have this track for that the hospitals or doctors end the lives of patients, I think are two kind of opposing belief systems. Because if we believe that suicide is to be stopped, I think we need to be clear about that assisted suicide is also suicide. It's just a different brand of suicide, so to speak. But then to then bring some nuance to this, I think that in Belgium, I interviewed a lot of people there. They think these concepts can coexist. Many, they don't think that the reaction I got was like, well, people always talk about this slippery slope when you introduce something like this, but we have introduced it. We had the slippery slope. More and more people are using assisted dying. I think in the Netherlands, it's about 5 to 6% of all deaths are now assisted. They don't seem to care much. It's like, okay.
And as societies, from the perspective of preventing suicides, Sweden has this plan of preventing all suicides. Very inspiring. But according to science, what can we do? What do we know that works on the society level?
Well, on the society level, I think the most clear example is to what's called in English then means restriction. So a means that's the method you use to try to end your life. So it would mean things like, well, don't have guns at home, or don't have poison at home, or make it harder to kill yourself. So it could be things like putting up fences on bridges. It's nowadays very difficult to use your car exhaust. I mean the things that come out of your car to suffer to die. You could do that 30 years ago, but now you can't. Long time ago, you could use your gas oven. That doesn't work anymore either. So by making it harder, it seems to reduce suicides, and also good to think about that. Typically, a couple of decades ago, before SSRIs, antidepressants were often toxic. So you could use the antidepressant that the doctor gave you to cure you from your suicidal thoughts and your depression, to kill yourself. It was kind of a dangerous situation. But now most medications are not so toxic. So that's like the probably most common way to address this on a societal level.
Okay. And if we have a person in our closest social network, a friend, colleague from work, a student from university, or a family member who's sharing such disturbing thoughts that they no longer see point in living, like what can we do as individuals?
Well, as individuals, I think it's, I understand that it is terrifying to hear that often. But I think to kind of stay with the person and stay in touch, show that you're willing to listen, I think is important. I believe that many people who are, chronically suicidal find it hard to talk to other people about it because people freak out. Even clinicians are very jumpy when this comes up, that they want to do something all the time, right? You need to go to the hospital, you need to get more medication. So it's also, I think, quite difficult to talk to people about this as a suicidal person, because
So not to be afraid to listen to someone.
And then, of course, sometimes you need to help people, help them to treatment or help them to professional help.
And as there are many different cases and stories in your book, do you have any favorite one, the one that you found the most, I don't know, significant or moving for some reason?
Well, I start the book with the death of my aunt Liz, who died, about 40 years ago. I was 11 years old when she died, and I write about it from my child perspective, how this kind of dark cloud was hanging over us. And when I wrote the book, I had to kind of also dig up this story or this thing that happened. And it was significant to me in the sense that I talked to my relatives for the first time about this, and it had been quiet about it. I think that this thing that it becomes so quiet around suicide is one of the, disturbing things, that it seems best to just pretend it never happened or call it an accident or something like that. So to me, for me, that's personally an important, story may sound a little bit wrong here, but important entry point into this subject. Also, as I think this idea that you addressed before, why did she do it? Never got resolved in a way. There was no letter, there was no explanation. Everyone had to make up their own idea about why it happened. And I think here everyone has to do it. It's almost unthinkable that you would have a person that you're close to that dies by suicide where you don't really try to, solve this puzzle of why. And it's to some extent not really solvable because you don't have the information. The person who had the information is dead.
Is it possible that the person who decides to end their life with suicide doesn't have that answer either?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah, I met people who were very close to dying, but didn't die. That said, they didn't know either why they did it. So it can be impulsive. It could happen when you're drunk or high or something. So I think we probably kind of overrate how much people know. It's not abstract knowledge. You may be in complete hopelessness and just don't see any way out, and feel very trapped, etc.
And are there any, I don't know, like key points or important moments that can kind of bring the person back to the living, from the desire to die more towards the wish for living?
Well, I think the one good message here, and the hopeful message, is that time is on our side in many ways. So even though maybe the psychotherapist or psychiatrist or whoever tries to help doesn't always have a unique method to use, typically suicide is not chronic, or suicidal thoughts is not chronic. So normally you would have it, and then if you can just stay alive, it will decrease. So I think that's good to know, that it's not normally a thought process that just goes on and on and on, but it goes up and down. So if you can survive the high peaks of suicidality, then you have very good odds of staying alive. I mean, in the book I interview a person who jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge. So the Golden Gate Bridge is probably the most well-known suicide hotspot in the world. It has become like famous for this, and it's very deadly to jump. It's very high. The water is cold, and you will risk of being by the stream of water out in the ocean, and you may be hit unconscious by the water, etc. So I think about 98-99% die. So you're really lucky if you stay alive. And he is now an advocate for suicide prevention. He and his father teamed up to promote the building of a fence, or it's actually a net at the Golden Gate Bridge to prevent suicides. But the interesting thing was that he said that it's about a 4-second jump and then you hit the water. In this 4 seconds, he said he immediately regretted it. And I think this is such a weird thing with this, that you can seem to be sure for a long time and plan it, and then when you do it, you regret it. So to me, that speaks to that we should do the most we can to save people from it. It's not like a expression of free will, or for the most part an expression of autonomy, I think. It may be sometimes, but it's not the typical ones.
So it may feel like it in a short moment of time, but then it can change very suddenly. Okay. And were there any other stories or interviews that you did when you were collecting some content for this book that for some reason you decided not to include here?
Yeah, probably. I mean, one thing I had to think about is, of course, not to make this... anyone who writes about suicide is worried what the effects could be of writing about suicide. That it somehow would inspire people or make it more likely that something happens. So I have excluded details and changed things so it would not provide technical information, things like that. I don't really remember that I removed... I had much more about the ancient history of suicide and how it was looked upon in the Roman times and Greek times, and that what was cut out a bit. Maybe it had been too challenging for some readers. And to answer the opposite of what you asked, if there was another story that really stuck with me was the interview with a woman who had she has bipolar disorder, and when she was about 27 years old, she applied for euthanasia in Belgium, and it was approved. So I interviewed her a couple of times 10 years later, because of half a year later, she withdrew from the process. She didn't want to die anymore. And it was really extremely interesting to talk to a person who has been through this process, who has been certain that she wanted to die and backed out, and how she reflected upon this later on. She was also, I would say, a very knowledgeable, intelligent person, so she could really describe it. And I also interviewed her husband, and this was like, to me, a experience that's kind of outside what you should expect as a human being to experience, that a young partner would be put on a list to die, right? That was just a, I don't know, shocking story. Maybe it seems like a far-fetched word, but I think this story is, I will remember those people for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm. So this is also a story of how the things can actually turn around. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in her case, she also would argue that, well, sometimes things get better when you get older. Not everything, not always, but it can change even without any, for reasons that you don't know. It's hard to predict. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So finding meaning in life, this is...
exactly, that's what she did. Mm-hmm. That's well put. Mm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And if you were to think of one thing that we discussed today, or something that is also in your book, like what could be like a takeaway message for our listeners or for your readers?
Well, I mean, well, maybe one thing would be that meaning, if you listen to this podcast, you are probably interested in meaning, I would guess. You belong to the part of the population that is meaning-oriented, I would assume. And I think that looking at suicide as the opposite of meaning, some kind of anti-meaning, where everything seems hopeless and meaningless, etc., and understand what it means to connect to meaning and find meaning in your life, or live some kind of meaningful life. I think that is something to consider. I mean, what is your like direction in life? And I'm saying that without wanting to impose the idea that you need to self-improve or become perfect or a fantastic person. I don't believe in that at all. But to live your life in accordance with your basic values, I think is a good idea. It will not, of course, protect you from the risk that you may be suicidal one day. It's not that living a meaningful life will be protective completely against it. But I think looking at suicide as like the opposite side of the coin here is interesting. Meaning and suicide are connected in my understanding.
Mm-hmm. And what gives your life meaning? How do you find meaning in your life?
Well, I now in my life, I find I'm becoming one of these people who find it quite easy to find things meaningful, anything. So it wasn't always like this for me, but now I'm becoming like this guy who just eats a sausage and doesn't have to think too much about it. But I find it extremely meaningful and interesting for me to learn about things like I wrote about in my book, and now I'm writing another book, and I can spend hours reading on, how was the PTSD diagnosis put together in the late 70s, and I find it fascinating. So I can entertain myself quite easily there.
Mm-hmm. So staying curious, engaged in your work.
Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm. And also, of course, family, friends, etc. is is important.
Absolutely, it is. Thank you very much, Professor Rück, for sharing with us today your expertise and being available to answer all the questions. And thank you very much for joining us today and listening to our podcast. Please stay tuned in. You can subscribe to our YouTube channels or to podcasts on Spotify. And if you wish to learn more about how to live life that is worth living, please take a look at Professor Rück's book.